So
Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Paul from the Larson Public Library. Today we have Julienne Ryan here, and she's going to talk about her book, The Learned in Queens Communications Playbook, Winning Against Digital Distraction. Julienne, how did you come up with the idea for this book?
hello and welcome. I'm really glad to be here and being part of this. So thank you, Paul, for letting me show up on your digital doorstep. Well, the book came about when I was working a lot in human resources, coaching a lot of people and listening to conversations and what got them into trouble. And then I was paying attention to other conversations in my personal life and what was getting us frustrated among friends and their families and their kids. But the real reason the book came together is it started its life as a speech. I was invited to give a talk at a large conference that was catering to executives, C-suite executives, who were there to talk about their technology and purchasing. And when I got there, when I heard about the speech, I thought, oh, great, how wonderful. I'm getting to go to this conference. I'm going to talk to people. This is great. And I'm going to get to talk about a topic I want to complain about. It's basically using our mobile phones and what's happening. Well, what happened is I had made a big assumption that I was giving a talk that was going to be down the hallway at a nice, conference room, maybe with 100 people, and it was going to be fairly small and intimate, till a colleague of me said, you're not talking just to a small group. You're talking to a group of 500 people on the big stage with a huge, one of those super, super large screens, at which point inside of me, I was like, what have I gotten myself into, and what the heck am I going to say to these people? So my answer to myself was, after a lot of ruminating, was keep it authentic. So when I started to play around with concepts, I realized, okay, they're going to hear my Queens accent. I can't fight that. I might as well have some fun with it. So that's really where it started. The title started small because that's one of my go-to expressions is when somebody said, ask me a common sense question, I'm always saying, I learned it in Queens. And then because we live in a culture that you have to have a really practical title in your book, I was like, okay, let's make it a playbook. We're very athletic and we're very competitive. And then my editor said, you're right. You're talking about digital communications. You need to put digital somewhere in the title. So it became the longest title that you could actually improve your breath control if you say this title more than once during the week because it's that long to say. But it's meant to be fun and it's meant to be a little poke at all our how-to books that we have out there.
Okay. What would you like your readers to learn or do?
Well, I would like them to learn how to listen and pay attention because we do a lot of listening without really hearing when we're talking to each other. And it gets worse when I'm going to probably flash the screen. Oh, here, it doesn't flash too much. When we use these things, when our kids are using these things, when we're using that, we read a lot into our text messages and our emails because we don't have context of voice or body language. We lose those cues because all we have is the written word and we're writing the script. Now, I brought a friend today who I've christened my big angry red guy because a lot of us, when we're in a conversation, we can sometimes react like him. And he's reacting to something he's reading on his phone and making an assumption that he knows exactly what the sender said. And in this case, it's not always true. So send him back because he's too scary to look at all the time. But he's my reminder prompt when I have it. So when I created this book, I did it as a funny book to really use visuals, a lot of visuals, to interrupt how we think and how we act, and to use it as a visual prompt. Because even though we have a lot of great books out there, and if we're working, we have PowerPoints, nobody has time to read a lot of things. So I wrote this book to disrupt how we're looking at our communications and have a laugh at the same time, because we're all doing this at the same time.
What are some of the unexpected things that have happened as a result of this book?
Well, one of the unexpected things is we've been living in these little Zoom screens for the last basically year and a half, 2 years. So what it's afforded me to do is travel around the world without leaving my room and visit people. So I've been doing presentations across the globe. So there was one gal, she came from Morocco originally. She's living in Germany. I was introduced to her by a Nigerian person who's living in Brooklyn, and I'm on a call with her. I've also had global calls where people have been from all over the globe on it, which is fun. And then showing up at conferences. Last month I was in Missouri virtually, using some of my book for a workshop. So it really does change. I think what it is also the unexpected plus of this book is using something that was really unique to me in my experience. And I think that's one of the messages that I do in my classes or my workshops when I speak, is using Queens as a prompt gave me the confidence to really use it in all my workshops. It's back in my background. It's quirky. I don't know if you've been to Queens much, but there's some usual conversational type. It's the most diverse borough in our city, if not, and the most diverse place probably in the country. So I got to have some fun with it and keep it light. So I take people on a visual journey around the borough.
Do you follow your own advice in the book?
Sometimes. Okay, but actually I keep the book on my desk because like I showed you that guy, there's a couple of funny pictures about how we sometimes need to learn how we're using our transference. We're putting a message or something we want on somebody else, and it's a good reminder. So of course I use it every day, and I also have it near my husband so I can remind him to pay attention and have eye contact. So one of the expressions I talk about at the beginning of the book is we have mutated as a human species. We have turned ourselves into a head-down, digitally distractive species. And a lot of times we're living in a bubble. And that is a big message of mine, that we're not always present and in the moment. And if you can bear with me, I'm going to read a page from a book that talks about that and what's happening when we're so digitally distracted. So when I think about our cyber messages, I visualize them like those gargoyles that were in the old Ghostbusters movies. Do you remember those sculptures that used to come over the building and fly around? So I think of our cyber messages coming to life and flinging them through cyberspace to reach us. And they're buzzing, and things are vibrating on our phones, and they're ringing and constantly pinging. So it's an unrelenting pursuit, and it never stops. The spirits of these e-messages churning up the sender and the receiver's motions because they're happening so rapidly. Now, we're never totally engaged or present. We are digitally distracted, and as I said early, it's going on an ongoing basis that we've tuned out everything around us. Now, it's challenging if the person who's trying to reach you knows you and has some context about why you're not being responding. Oh, he's in this meeting at the library. Oh no, I'll get him an hour or so later. They may know you're out of the office, or they may know that you don't like getting messages you don't want to respond to, and you're really bad at paying attention to them. So what happens, though, is my point, is if the person you're unexpectedly ignoring is from a different culture? What happens if they're from a different age group? And they have different values about what's important about digital communications and different expectations. What about a real important conversation loses? What happens then? Do they feel disrespected or not? So many of us don't look at, many of us are so focused on our personal getting it done that we're not aware of the dynamic we're creating. So those e-spirits are constantly coming to life, and if we're not careful, we're going to get in trouble. So ironically, we're simultaneously perpetrators and sufferers of digital distractions at the same time. We're giving as good as we get. whether we realize it or not. And that's the thing. I'm sure when you get off the phone or the Zoom here, you're going to find out how you like umpteen messages now waiting from you and emails you got to get through. So it's really about being patient and taking the time to connect with people is one of the things.
Okay. Do you have any tips for, for getting us through the digitally distracted world?
Well, first of all, well, you can read the book, which is a few minutes, but to have more fun. I think one of the things that I've realized is the simplest and easy thing, because my thing is I spent way too much time with lawyers in offices negotiating things that could have been solved quite simply with a reasonable conversation, or where people just dug in a little bit more to show up in person and get off the emails. A lot of times we do group emails where one person says a comment. If you're in an organization, you're sending out a group email, somebody else needs to weigh in, and nobody is reading what's happening in the email. And one person's trying to out-talk or outrank each other on their email. So taking yourself off email and doing a one-to-one conversation, and a lot of times picking up the phone. That's something a lot of the younger generation would rather not do, but it is a game changer. And in the book, I have a lot of examples about assumptions that were happening. I remember having one vendor that was sponsoring an event I was working on with an organization. And we all made an assumption that person's going to foot the bill on a lot of things. So when I called her or emailed her and said, well, when's the next step? This woman really took offense. And only because I picked up the phone and I reached out to her that I was able to placate it. And I was like, look, I had the wrong understanding. I didn't throw my colleagues under the bus, but I basically smoothed it over and said, I'm glad we talked and we were able to work through things. There is one thing that I learned from somebody when I was working on this book. She was like, oh, you brought our analogies to life. Because in our world of digital world, sometimes the messages are not getting through. And that's the other thing. They're getting blocked. They're being put into spam. And we think people are receiving our messages. So we're getting frustrated. We're thinking we're getting ignored. We think they don't want to hear from us. And really and truly, they haven't seen our messages or they've just been blocked. And I don't know about you. Are you on multiple social media?
Yeah, but I really don't pay attention that much to it.
Oh, see?
Yeah, I'm one
there you are. Yeah. Well, with the digital, we have Facebook. Some of us are Instagram now. Then there's LinkedIn. So I find that a lot of us are working harder to connect with people now because we don't know where you or others are going to show up. So I'm going to send you an email. Then I'm going to send you a text message. Then I may send a LinkedIn message to say, by the way, did you see the other two messages? So by the time you're done, you're thinking, oh, where are you hanging out? It's not like you're hanging out in the park. And I say, okay, Paul's always in the park. I'm going to go visit Paul today and go hang out with him. But so it's kind of trying to figure out how you can connect with somebody and manage that frustration. Because usually the script in our head is not the script that's happening. So I think that's one of my comments I'm always constantly telling people. Be patient. Get out of your own head and just try to keep going and calling somebody. Because I make fun of the characters. We talked about gremlins. I also talk about that our thoughts can be like those kids in the playground when we're growing up. You always have like one that was a bully or somebody that was always instigating a challenge. And they're always the ones you have to have a handle on. And sometimes when somebody hits our emotional buttons, those little inner children want to get us into trouble. So I do a little bit of a talk in the book about you got to hang on to those inner children and not let them get on your nerves and get you into trouble and say the things that you can't pull back into your mouth afterwards. So just be patient.
I mean, do you think this technology today has benefited us, or you think life was better, 40 years ago when it was only a phone call was the main communication thing?
I am not anti-technology. I'm anti-bad conversations. I think that's the point I always want to make. And listen, it was frustrating when there was only one. I grew up with one phone in the house, pre-answering machine that you would be waiting there, for someone to call. Then there were voicemail services, and that was great. So you knew you could find your messages. But I think we become less patient, and we do things very quickly and instant and soundbite. I remember, sometimes sitting in an office where I would get pinged in 2 seconds, and then somebody would be at my door if I hadn't responded to their message. I'm like, it's been 20 seconds, like give me a chance to recuperate. So I think we're lacking in patience. And the other thing is, again, the lack of visual and auditory cues makes us have our own assumptions. There's a great author, Sherry Turkle, who's at MIT, that writes about the science of this. So where my book is humorous and talking in a very narrative form and making fun of us in a very, almost like a cartoonish book, she writes about the theory behind it, that we lose that skill of developing empathy when we're voice to voice and eye to eye. So right now, there'd be a good case in point. I know what you're doing. You're checking the screens and everything. And I'm like, is Paul listening to me? Is he paying attention? And at least I have the visual cues. And so when we give full focus to somebody, and that's one of my big messages, if you can spend time giving somebody full on focus, that is important. So my guidance when I'm teaching with groups and doing communication groups is full on focus and finding places to have in your space conversations like we're doing now, ideally in person or even in voice. So you don't have to, you can avoid those in your face conversations when you've lost patience and you think that person doesn't get me or not listening to me.
Yeah, I was just checking because sometimes people have problems getting to meetings, so I always make sure
I know,
that I'm looking over
know.
here. Sorry.
No,
Um,
it's just an example because you're fidgety with a purpose because you want to make sure you haven't lost anybody and everything's working. So that's part of the distraction. Like you're doing exactly what you should be doing, and you're asking questions at the same time. So we're all multitasking. So.
yeah, it's just always interesting. Like texting is so much longer than picking up the phone and calling people. Like, yeah, there's people have a 10, 20-minute text conversation with something you could tell them over the phone in like a minute.
Yeah, and I always talk about that too, and I think that's that you hit the nail on the head because that's exactly what you should do when you're finding. I think texts work for things like good job, see you later, I'm on the 405, like little manageable sound bites, and even that you have to sometimes give more detail about where you are. When it gets to avoiding something, that's not the time. When it's a negative or something that really needs an explanation. And like I've been accused of sometimes I think people understand like where my text is coming from, but they haven't read like other messages. So they're looking at it and going, what the heck? So I think it's just, we expect everybody to be in our head, but sometimes we don't expect to be in everybody else's head when we're doing it.
Right. So where can we find this book?
Amazon, of course. Um, when you just Google communication playbook, it's there. And also on my website, there's a click at J. Ryan Partners, and it shows the workshops I give, the communications. Because part of the bigger message about this book isn't it's digital communications, but it's saying being patient to have what I call front stoop moments. I grew up in Queens where we called our steps in our house stoops. It's a expression left over from the Dutch, even though they've been gone a while. The British didn't get rid of it, and it still exists in Brooklyn and Queens. And what I'm encouraging people doing, we're living in a world where people are pretty impatient with each other. We don't always listen to our communications. And if we can find time to just spend with each other, to build context when we're communicating and doing more listening than talking. It's easy when we get excited about a conversation, we want to jump in. But I think if we just flip the ratio of listening versus talking, a lot more can get done and we can move towards having more important conversations. So out of all my joking and messing around in the book and making fun of Queens and everything, there is the mission about find ways to listen and be more patient with each other. So that's part of it.
I remember seeing like at a restaurant, there's like 4 teenagers and they all have their phones, looking at their phones, and they're never talking to each other. They're just probably either texting each other, even though they're right next to each other, but they're not. I always found that kind of crazy. That's
It is. And I've given classes when I was doing more in person in the time before COVID. I would bring a basket to class if I was giving a talk. It wasn't even about the book. The book wasn't even born yet. And I would collect the phones. I would even bring labels so that everyone could label their phone and show exactly where the basket was. And you could see like the physical pain of somebody saying like, you're separating me from my property. But it brought the focus into the room and the present. And there's more and more writing happening about that, the psychology, about the neuroscience of giving people permission to unplug from things around it and just focus, and your listening changes, your memory changes, your emotional state changes. And you and I, like, we've had a nice rapport. You've been very patient with me chatting, but we don't have to see each other all the time. But once we have one or two engagements like that, we've built trust, and that's the whole thing. We start to appreciate that memory of that. You paid attention, you listened, and that creates the baseline for some good relationships. And that's the mission on any of the work I've ever done, is some trust, some communication, and connectedness. And if you're not going over and looking at this and allowing ourselves to be bored, allowing for that space of a lull in a conversation is huge. And I think that's an art that we need to build, the art of conversation, because sometimes the most amazing sharings come out when there is a little tension in the room, when a conversation takes a lull and then it picks up again and somebody takes a chance to share something. So I'm like, we need to relax and just enjoy that person-to-person experience now more than ever, when we're kind of creeping back into real time. You and I were talking earlier about what it was like. I gave a talk not too long ago, a live presentation. And when I went into the room, I felt like Margaret Mead, because I was like, I remember these creatures. They're humans. Oh my God, I can see them in three-dimensional mode. I can come over and overhear what they're saying. I was able to work some of those comments into the talk. So I think, like, look for moments to really have some fun in person and just take ourselves off our digital devices for a while and just be in the moment.
It's crazy how young the technology is, 10, 12 years, and it's like a huge part of most people's lives nowadays. I don't know. We'll see in the future how much this really affects, people's communication. And
Yeah,
I hope it gets better, but I don't know. It might just get worse.
I know. And I keep reading about the Neuro, but like when I wrote this book, I purposely didn't want to make it a scientific journal. I wanted to do it as a fun book to use as a guiding thing, as a conversation piece. But the science is in there, and I've been connecting with people who are researching the neural part of it, and it'll help. Like you said, it's going to be very interesting to see with the kids coming up the ranks about patience and conversation. But kids are smart. Kids are smart. Like, we have great nieces and uncles that sit around the table and have conversations. My husband's from Ireland, so if you have funny stories and they're at least within earshot, you can engage a whole group of multi-generational folks. I have a lot of faith, and that's the point. Like, between storytelling and good conversations, there's ways of getting people in the room and sharing.
Do you plan on writing another book?
Yes. Not this year, but I love food, and when I grew up in Queens, food was always a big part of our experience. I grew up going to school with a lot of multicultural kids from all over, starting with Cubans and different parts of South America, and I always learned about others and communication through eating and shared meals. And I think food tells such a great story when you sit down with somebody and find out what their favorite recipe and how they learn to cook a certain dish and why they eat. So my book will probably have something to do with food and something to do with Queens and the whole power of communications behind that. And I've said it twice already, so I have to make it happen now because I've told it in a few podcasts. So that's a great way to get your homework assignment out there. You say it live and record it. You have to live up to it. But I'm slowly writing articles about it on LinkedIn about food and what I learned from shared meals. So, and I get to eat then. Maybe I get invited to a lot of the food festivals. That'll be great.
Do you want to read some of your favorite quotes from the book,
I think I'd like to
or
read.
read a segment, short segment?
Yeah, I think one of the things is maybe in the chat now, this would be a good time to open up to some questions because I make fun of Queens. And I'm curious to know if anybody in the group has been to Queens, have relatives from Queens, or is from Queens.
Well, I've been to Queens to see the Mets a few times.
Okay, so that is so what I was saying about Queens is basically living in Queens made me and the rest of the fellow Queensites scrappy and resilient because we always had to try hard to gain the respect and the recognition because in Queens there was a whole hierarchy, or in the boroughs, basically. So Manhattan was always top of the heap. Then you had Brooklyn and the Bronx competing. Staten Island and Queens were the ones competing for last place. So we had to try harder and to communicate. And in the book, I write about the fact that you have all these quirky personalities types came out of there, from Kristen Walken, Cyndi Lauper came out of there, John Leguizamo. It was a breeding ground for unique humor. And I think one of the things is because we grew up in a lot of different nationalities, so we're always trying to figure out how to navigate the borough and also how to navigate communication. So that was one of the reasons I use Queen as the analogy. Confusing place, lots going on, but people keep it real there, basically.
Okay.